She was a whore.
Say that word again.
And what? You'll kill your own father in the privy? No. You're my son. Now, enough of this nonsense.
I am your son, and you sentenced me to die. You knew I didn't poison Joffrey, but you sentenced me all the same. Why?
Enough. We'll go back to my chambers and speak with some dignity.
I can't go back there. She's in there.
Are you afraid of a dead whore? You shot me. You're no son of mine.
I am your son. I have always been your son.
Look for me. Beneath the tree. He saw us! North.
Ointment, that's not a monster, I told Cersei. That's just a baby. And she said he killed my mother. And she pinched your little cock so hard I thought she might pull it off until your brother made her stop. It doesn't matter, she told us. Everyone says he will die soon. I hope they are right. He should not have lived this long.
Well, sooner or later, Cersei always gets what she wants.
And what about what I want? Justice. For my sister and her children.
If you want justice, you've come to the wrong place.
I disagree. I've come to the perfect place. I want to bring those who have wronged me to justice, and all those who have wronged me are right here. I will begin with Sir Gregor Clegane, who killed my sister's children, and then raped her with their blood still on his hands, before killing her too. I will be your champion.
My name's not Elaine. It's Sansa Stark, eldest daughter of Lord Eddard Stark. Lord Royce, we met when you came to Winterfell. You were escorting your son Sir Waymar to the wall.
Sansa Stark? You tell lies right to my face, you little worm.
Lord Baelish has told many lies. All to protect me. And then, one day, she saw him kiss me.
Lady Sansa.
It was a peck on the cheek, Lord Royce, nothing more. Lord Baelish is my uncle now, in truth, by marriage. He's always been so kind to me. I was so happy to be here, to be free, all because of him. But my aunt turned on me. She cursed me, called me a whore, promised to throw me through the moon door. When Lord Baelish tried to calm her, she struck him. She said she didn't want to live anymore. She stood on the edge of that moon door. He tried to reason with her, promised her she was the only one he had ever loved. But she stepped through those doors and she was...
It's not your fault, sweet girl. It's not your fault.
Night gathers. Now my watch begins. It shall not end until my death. I shall take no wife, hold no lands, father no children. I shall wear no crowns and win no glory. I shall live and die by my post. I am the sword in the darkness. I am the watcher on the walls. I am the shield that guards the realms of men. I pledge my life and honor in the night's watch. Release night!